So, you've been asked to do a training. A very important thing is to figure out, once you know what they need to know, figure out how you're actually going to teach it to them. What is the content that you're going to put into your training? This is an important question, and this is the question that Chapter 5 is trying to answer, the content of training. Now, I think your book does a pretty good job of going over ways to do research, important considerations concerning plagiarism and copywriting, and I think that you should pay attention to that and read it thoroughly. But I don't feel like the book very well answers the actual question, which is, how do you develop the content for a training? Now, of course, it's going to be needs-based, based on the needs of your organization. That's why you did a needs assessment. But need doesn't always translate in an obvious way into an actual way of doing a training. In fact, a need can be filled in a lot of different ways. In a certain way, you've determined how hungry they are, or kind of what they're hungry for, but there are a lot of different kinds of way of meeting a particular hunger. A lot of times we want something salty, but there's a lot of different salty foods out there. So what I hope to get through today in this video is to discuss some of the ways that you can generate ideas for a training. So let's talk about this, strategies for generation. How do you generate an idea? Real question, how do you generate an idea? How do you come up with a thought? So the first and sort of obvious answer is you think, right? The first thing that you need to do when you're doing a training is you need to think about it. Sit down, or don't sit, walk, drive, shower, whatever you do, think about the thing that you're actually going to be training. What am I talking about? What is going on here? Why have I been asked to do this? Slush it around in your head. So really the first step is to just put it in your head. And I'm not going to teach you how to think. You already know how to do that. Think about it, right? So that's the first thing. Usually what I do from thinking is it'll be in my head, it'll be washing around for a few days. I may talk to a few people. I may, bring it up in a couple conversations with people I think are smart, or just random people. I just say, hey, what do you think about this? So you may transform thinking into thinking together. You don't always have to think alone. But that's step one. The second thing I do is I write about it. Get some stuff down on paper. A lot of times I'll think about stuff a lot. I'll be going back and forth between ideas, and I'll feel like I don't know what to say. But then when I sit down and I start writing, it starts becoming more natural. It's flowing out of me, and I'm getting down ideas, and I'm having thoughts that I wasn't even having before I was writing, and the advantage of writing is that once you're done, there's something there, right? So first think, then write, okay? And this I'm not going to give you a bunch of advice on. But after you've got these two important things done, there's an important concept that is called a heuristic device that I think is very important for generating more ideas than the ones that come out of your head without prodding and come out of your writing without prodding. So, heuristic device is the thing that I want to draw our attention to now. So a heuristic device, it's a fancy word. A heuristic device is an idea that helps you generate more ideas. And in truth, you have 100,000 heuristic devices floating around your head at all times. Heuristic just means discovery. It means to make a revelation, to reveal something, or in a way to teach. And a device, we mean an object, right, that does something. And in the case of ideas, this device is a mental device. It's a mental tool that you use to generate more ideas. Let me give you an example of a heuristic device. Most of us know that there's good stuff out in the world, right? Good stuff is good. But sometimes there's too much of a good thing. Now that's a concept that you know. Most of us are familiar with the idea that there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. And even though it might be good here and it might be good here, eventually it becomes not good. So, alcohol is a classic example of this. Alcohol, it's fun, right? You drink. I was having it okay. I'm having a better, after one drink, I'm having a better time. After 2 drinks, I'm having an even better time. After 3 drinks, wow, this is awesome. You could infer that 50 drinks is going to be way even more awesome than only 3. But for most people, and usually it's before 50 drinks, it stops being a good thing. It becomes too much of a good thing, and it starts becoming a bad thing, and it can become a very bad thing. Chocolate is the same way. Chocolate is a good thing. I just stole some chocolate from a teacher's room. I didn't steal it. It was in a little dish. I ate the chocolate, and it was good. But if the dish was in my office, I would eat all of the chocolates, and there is such a thing as eating way too much chocolate, right? There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So, that concept, too much of a good thing, is, in a way, a heuristic device. And you can use that concept, and you can apply it to a particular situation to generate an idea about that situation. And you're thinking to yourself, how the heck does this apply to training? Well, let's take something that is an interesting hot topic amongst workplaces right now, and that is employee networking, right? Building information networks between employees. Now, when I say I want networked employees, is employee networking a good thing? Sure, it's a great thing. You don't really have an organization if you don't have networks. And the thing that this person learns over here, if there's no network, they're the only one who benefits from it. But if there is a network, man, it goes out to everybody else, and the best ideas can survive, and your organization can thrive. So networking, employee networking, great, right? It's something that you want. But apply our little device. Is there such a thing as too much employee networking? Think on it for a second. Is there such a thing as too much networking? Well, networking has a cost, right? There's the media that the network uses, right? So if everybody's talking to everybody all of the time, if that's happening in a room, it might be too much noise, like physical noise. So sometimes networks interfere with each other. You could also have too much networking in that you'd have too much sharing, and you'd be overloading the technical aspects through file sharing. There could be so much sharing that there's no control over information. So if every single employee knows everything about every part of the organization, it won't be very hard for that information to get out. People could join the organizations just enough to get the information and then go and take it and exploit it. And so your ideas can be stolen by competitors, or it can be published in the newspaper. So there can be too much networking in that way. Networking is another cost, which is that networking takes time, right? So I might want my employees to network, but if they're networking all of the time, then they're not spending any time doing what they're supposed to be doing, which probably involves customers and making the company money. So if they're only ever networking, then they're over-networked and they're not doing anything. They don't have anything to network about. They're just interacting all the time. When I think of high school students on Facebook, I think of people with a lot of networks. There's a lot of interaction there. But I think that if I were an employer, it would be too much. It would be too much interaction. So all I did is I took that one idea, too much of a good thing, and I applied it to the thing that I was going to do a training about, which in this case, for our random example, was employee networking. And while I might have sat down and thought of what I know about employee networking, and I might have written about what I know about employee networking, and I might have gone out and found information about employee networking from other folks, if I hadn't stopped, I might have been operating under the assumption that employee networking was always a good thing, and that more of it was always better. So, the heuristic device reveals something that we might not have thought of on our own. So, let's get into some more specific heuristic devices for the purpose of training. We have already outlined a few heuristic devices. One of them was the distinction between cognitive, affective, and psychomotor learning. So, knowing, feeling, doing. So if you're going to teach about employee networking, or let's say you're going to teach leadership skills, or you're going to teach conflict negotiation, what do they need to know about conflict negotiation? What do they need to feel about conflict negotiation? And what do they need in order to do conflict negotiation? So as you're generating ideas, as you're creating content, sometimes our minds stick to one of these. Okay, well, here are some tips. If your list is only tips, but no thought to building up their confidence, or getting them motivated to actually doing it, or having them actually understand it, then it'll be a little too psychomotor heavy, and you won't get enough other stuff. So, one heuristic device that as a teacher you can run through your mind is cognitive, affective, psychomotor. So I'm putting my stuff together. Do I have cognitive, affective, and psychomotor components to this training? Do I have all of them? We also have the information motivation application, which serves as a heuristic device. So as I'm developing the content, I think, what is it that I'm saying? How can I motivate them to want to do this thing, and how can I show them how it's actually used? So, what is the thing? What is the information? But what is the motivation for them to learn it, pushing them towards it, and what is the application, the trajectory after the information? So that's another heuristic device. Here I am, I'm talking about conflict negotiation. Oftentimes, people focus a lot on information. So I'd come up with, introductions to a couple of theories, some good ideas on a methodology for conflict negotiation, strategies for taking care of these disasters. That's all information. But what do I need to put in my training to also motivate them to want to actually negotiate conflicts? How do I get them to learn this information? How do I get them to see conflict negotiation as something that's valuable? And then also, how can they actually do it, right? So information, motivation, application. It's another heuristic device for coming up with content. Another question that I like to ask involves skills and sets of skills. So we have this idea of skill. And often in training, we're focused on skills. But skills exist inside sets of skills. So there's this one idea of leadership. And leadership itself is kind of a broad idea, and there are some subcomponents to leadership, right? So one thing that I can treat the thing that I'm training as itself a set, and then break down the subsets of that skill. So leadership involves, well, public speaking, it involves decision making, it involves organization, and it involves relationships. If I was just going to randomly create a skill set that leadership, broke down into. But the reverse is also true. Leadership itself is a skill that exists in a broader set of skills. So leadership, one could argue, is a communication skill, and so there is leadership, but then there's also negotiation, facilitation, teaching, listening, all of this other stuff. So here's the broader skill set, communication, and leadership is one of the sub-skills inside of this. Identifying where a skill is in kind of the broad spectrum of humanity, it's not a perfect science, but it sometimes helps you. Because often if you're trying to teach a big skill set, sometimes it's good to know the things that are in part, because one of the ways you can approach it is say, okay, to get to this thing, they've got to do these 4 or 5 things. So while in 2 hours I can't teach all of leadership, I might be able to break it down into a more manageable chunk, and I might pick something identified by my needs assessment, a chunk of that skill that these people really need to know. So the skill and the sets of skills that existed. Another thing that I like to think about are relationships. And in this case, I don't mean interpersonal relationships, but I mean statistical. Or conceptual. So I'm going to teach you three. You've probably heard these if you've ever had a stats class. There's such a thing as a direct relationship, where as we move up in this variable, we also move up in this variable. So the hotter and hotter it gets in the room, the sweatier and sweatier I get. Right? The hungrier and hungrier I am, the grumpier and grumpier I become. Right? So that would be, there's a direct relationship between my hunger and my grumpiness. Right? So in a more serious example that pertains to the workplace, there may be a direct relationship between task-specific training and task performance. Right? So the more and more trained I get, the better and better I get at it. So that's one relationship. There's, of course, the opposite, which is an indirect relationship, which means that as this goes up and up, this actually goes down and down. So, the more and more tired I get, the less and less I'm able to learn. That one's pretty reasonable. So if I'm not tired, zero tiredness equals high ability to learn. Lots of tiredness equals low ability to learn. It's pretty profound to know whether or not increasing something is going to make the other thing go up or make the other thing go down. Now these two are basic. The last one is a little trickier, and it's called a curvilinear relationship. And it basically means that while this and this are related, depending on where we're at, depends on whether or not it causes an increase or a decrease. So, let me give you an example. Stress. Let's say stress is here on the bottom, and productivity is here on the side. Does stress increase or decrease your productivity? Well, that's a hard question. If I've got no stress, a lot of the times I don't care at all, and so I'm not productive. That would be true here, right? People who don't care, who truly do not give a shit, you probably aren't going to be very productive. No stress, no productivity. So what do people do? Our bosses get on us, they increase our stress levels. The people who love us give us crap until we get busy. And we give ourselves our own crap, right? And as that stress is rising, so too does the productivity rise. Right? But there becomes a point where we become too stressed. We have 5 classes. Our teachers are all yelling at us. Our boss is screaming at us. My roommate's bitching at me. My boyfriend or girlfriend is causing me problems. And eventually, that productivity starts dropping. Because I'm so busy being stressed, so much of my energy is going into that. All I'm thinking about is everything that I have to do. And so, I can't do anything at all. So is there a direct relationship between stress and productivity? No. There's a direct relationship if you only look at it here, but if you look at the whole chart, it actually drops off at a certain point. So go back to that example of employee networking. Does employee networking increase or decrease productivity or effectiveness in the workplace? My guess, and this is just a guess, you should do some research to find out if this is true, but my guess is that it's somewhat curvilinear, that no networking is bad, but too much networking is probably not so good either. Probably doesn't drop off that bad. It probably goes a little bit more like that. And know that sometimes things plateau, right? So, does years of experience help? Well, certainly you learn a lot in the beginning, but then it starts to taper off. And it might be that it doesn't matter whether you've been there 6 years or 8 years. Probably not. So these relationships, these statistical or conceptual relationships, I find are very helpful when I'm planning a training session, because a lot of times we operate under these more simple relationships. You know, more of this equals good, and I contend, and you will find this to be true also, that there are more complex relationships than just, you know, one-to-one correspondences between you know, the thing you're trying to train and the output that you want out of it. So pay attention to more complicated relationships. A lot of people will say, leadership is a great thing, we should all be leaders, we should all be trying to be leaders all of the time, because it's awesome and it does everything. And that usually sends off a little heuristic alarm bell in the back of my mind where I think, is that true? Do we really all need to be leading all of the time? Does that even make sense? Does it make sense if there's nobody following to be leading? What are we missing in this equation? So, that's an important thing. It helps me generate ideas that causes me to seek out better and more interesting information. Another heuristic device concerning skills is to ask, where are we at in this process? So skill acquisition is a process, and figuring out where we are is important, because then you know what's come before and what there is to come after. So while conflict negotiation is a pretty complex thing, so you should identify, as part of the needs assessment, where in this process, everybody who's socialized, everybody who knows another human, knows something about conflict negotiation. So where are they in that process? What are the learnings that brought them up here that I can tap, and what are the learnings that go on from here that I need to set myself up for? One of the things that's neat about a process heuristic is it helps you think kind of like more long-term and say, okay, so I've got 2 hours to teach them. I can't teach them all of it, but I can teach them this and this, and I can teach them this one extra thing which will help them in the future when they run into this sort of thing. So that's the last heuristic device that I'm going to go through, which is long-term, short-term. Ask yourself, what are my long-term goals and what are my short-term goals? What do I want them to be able to do today, and what do I want to set them up for in the future? Teaching for the long term is a little different than teaching for the short term. And in a training session, which tends to focus on short-term learning objectives, you also, as an employer and as a trainer, want to have an eye on development. That's why it's called training and development, because you want, to not only be training in the short term, you want to be developing in the long term. So ask yourself, have I only addressed short-term issues? Have I only addressed long-term issues? Is there a way of addressing these short-term issues with long-term issues in mind? That's useful. Anyway, the last thing that I want to leave you with is this. You're going through all of this stuff, and this isn't, when I say generation of ideas, it doesn't always mean that you make it up. In fact, it's harder to make something up than it is to find it usually. So I'm not saying that what you need to do is sit around and just BS a bunch of stuff using heuristic devices, but oftentimes these create questions. Is it always good, or is there some such a thing as too much of a good thing? Now I have a question that I can go out into the research and find stuff about. Is there such a thing as too much networking? Good question. That gives me a question that I can ask experts. Have you seen a time when? I get information, motivation, application. It kicks off this idea, but I might find that I'm only focusing on applications, and I really don't know why I'm asking them to know that skill. So that's going to involve a little back research in the company to see, oh, well, here are the problems that have been caused by this skill not being nailed down, and this is all the money that it's costing the company. Now, these create questions for further research. The The last, and this is kind of an overall heuristic, not only for creating the content of your training, but for your entire training, consider this. A training that's done by an external consultant particularly, but a training almost always is a three-way agreement between the trainer, the trainee or the employees, and the person who hired the trainer, right? Because we've got the trainer, and that's you. We've got the people that you're engaging in the relationship with, and we've got the person who's facilitating that, who recognizes that new servers need to be trained in the ways that the place works. Now, all three of you have your own interests. The boss wants to increase productivity, probably at a low cost. The employee wants to probably keep their job until they don't want it anymore, and they want probably to deliver their services in a way that meets with their standards of work, and they may be looking for what slack they can. And you, as a trainer, well, you want to keep your job, and you want to deliver things, but you also might have agendas of your own and have your own way of interpreting the world. So all three of us, we're sort of three stakeholders in this. And so when I'm coming up with a training program, I always ask myself, what do I want them to know? What do they want to know? And what does the boss want them to know? Because the boss is my boss too. Now, that doesn't mean that the boss's interests overcome the other interests, and sometimes the interests are opposed. Sometimes the boss brings the consultant in, brings the trainer in, to solve a problem their way amongst the people. Sometimes it's token. Sometimes the employees come to the boss with a legitimate complaint, and the boss, to offer a token solution to the legitimate complaint, hires you as the trainee to say, well, look, we solved that. We had a train. We spent 4 hours on it. We had a company training facility, right? And you coming into the organization, you see certain sites of abuse, you see certain things that haven't been done right, and there are interests that you're going to have, things that you're going to want to teach. But you want to try to balance all three of those, because those are three important stakeholders, right? The boss is facilitating it, and they're the person ultimately responsible for the organization. The employees are the people who are actually doing the skill, and you are the expert whose reputation is resting on it also. So you want to, in a perfect world, all three of those needs get met. And it's usually possible. Usually the issues aren't so bad that you have to pick a side. But in a way, you're playing all three sides. If the employer knew how to teach the employees what they wanted them to know, then they would do it. They wouldn't need you. And so in a way, you are hired as a mediator between these power structures in order to make knowledge known. I find that that is also helpful in generating ideas. Just ask, what do I want them to know? What do they want to know? And what does the boss want them to know? Those three questions, plus another handful of heuristic devices, starts your brainstorm. We'll get into later in further lectures how to sort through this brainstorm, but I suggest when you are generating ideas, generate a lot. Pages and pages if it's a long thing. You don't have to use everything you think of, but just write it down. If you're a typer, type it up, or I work in a notebook sometimes, and just free yourself, right? Write down as many ideas as come to your head. You can throw them out, hone them down, weed them out later. But it's important when creating content that you create a lot of it. Dump a lot of data into a document. Copy and paste a lot of crap. And just start generating a giant corpus of knowledge. Because even if you don't use it, a lot of times someone will ask you a question, and a broad readiness to deal with the issue will improve your ability to answer those questions.